Good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone, and welcome to Critical Conversations, a discussion which bridges interdisciplinary perspectives on issues posing critical challenges to humanity. Today's Critical Conversations session is entitled The Bad and the Ugly, Internet Governance in an Era of Disinformation. My name is Anne Fitzgerald. I'm the director of the Balsillie School of International Affairs, and I'm delighted to be moderating this session today. Welcome to all of you in the audience today. If you have any questions for the panelists, please submit these questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom panel, and we will do our best to channel those to the appropriate panelists, particularly towards the end of the session. Before we begin, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. One of the actions we take here in Canada to advance reconciliation between the settler and Indigenous peoples is to reflect on our relationship with the land and the continuous process of colonization that deeply impacts our work. Acknowledging the land is the process of deliberately naming that this is Indigenous land and that Indigenous peoples have rights to this land. The Balsillie School of International Affairs sits on the Haldimand Tract, which is the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee peoples. Now to introduce our panelists. We are honored and privileged today to welcome these global thought leaders on issues related to internet governance. Samantha Bradshaw is a postdoc fellow at the Program on Democracy and Internet and the Digital Civil Society Lab. Her fellowship work examines gender dimensions of disinformation and how harassment and misogyny are used to suppress the political participation of women online. Samantha has published in leading academic journals, including New Media and Society, Internet and Policy, Internet Technology and Regulation, and the Columbia Journal of International Affairs. Her research and public writing has also been featured by numerous media outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, the Globe and Mail, and the Financial Times, and also Bloomberg Magazine. Mark Raymond is the Wick Carey Associate Professor of International Relations and the director of the Cyber Governance and Policy Center at the University of Oklahoma. He's the author of Social Practices of Rulemaking in World Politics. His work appears in various academic journals, including International Theory, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Strategic Studies Quarterly, and the Cyber Defense Review. He is the co-editor of Organized Chaos, Reimagining the Internet. He was a senior advisor with the US Cyberspace Solarium Commission and has testified before the UN Commission on Science and Technology for Development and participated in the Internet Governance Forum. Thank you both for being with us today. Mark, I'm going to start with you and ask you about the general issue of Internet governance. What is it and who does it?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you to everyone for being here today. And thank you for the invitation to join the event. So if we're talking about internet governance, there's kind of a couple of ways we can take that. The narrower way and the more historically sort of relevant way would be to refer to a set of technical operations that make the internet possible. So these are things like internet naming and addressing, the routing of internet data that really underpins everything that we do online, including obviously what we're doing today. So these kinds of operations are mainly handled in the private sector by network operators, by companies of various kinds that have roles in the internet ecosystem. So those can be everything from the people who manufacture and design hardware and software to the people that actually operate a network like Rogers in Canada, or AT&T or Verizon or Comcast in the United States, or other firms around the world. Those sort of actors have a really key role in transiting data across the internet. The way that's sort of done and coordinated involves a different set of organizations that do a lot of technical standard setting. So they write the code and the protocols that make this possible, because in order for the internet to work, everyone has to use the same codes and protocols so that everything interconnects properly. Those organizations include things like the International Organization for Standardization. They include very centrally the Internet Engineering Task Force and the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which are basically voluntary and private nonprofit organizations globally, based mainly historically in the United States, but increasingly becoming global, that handle those kinds of operations. The broader view is kind of layered on top of that and includes a whole bunch of related public policy issues And that's where you start to see governments becoming more involved or feeling that they have more of a stake in the conversation, because of course the things that we do online are the same things as that we do in real life. There's increasingly not much of a distinction between online and offline life, which means that all of the sort of human behavior problems that we experience and use governments to regulate and legislate and then enforce law and regulation are present online too. And that sort of broader sense of internet governance, or at least internet policy, I think it's fair to say, is increasingly sort of bumping into these historically technical areas of actually operating the internet. The last piece, of course, are other kinds of private companies that we usually refer to as platforms. Samantha is much more an expert on those than I am, and so I'm sure she'll sort of pick up on the role of those social media platforms and other kinds of internet platforms that basically offer services, usually through apps or websites or other kinds of methods over top of the internet, kind of at what we call often the content layer of the internet. It's the thing that we actually see and interact with as humans. So that's kind of a quick crash course on what internet governance is and who does it and how we can think about it.
Really helpful. Thank you so much. Samantha, I want to turn to you now because we're hearing the expression over and over again that we're living in the age of disinformation. And people also argue that actually we've always lived in the age of disinformation, but it's reaching a new crescendo because of social media and the ability to amplify it so prolifically, so quickly. So can you tell us what is new about disinformation on social media? How do digital technologies change disinformation and propaganda in new ways?
Yeah, definitely. Thanks for the question. And also thanks everyone for joining the session, both here live and virtually later. Propaganda and disinformation, like you said, Anne, they've been around for forever. As long as people have been trying to persuade one another of something, we've had propaganda, we've had disinformation. But there are certain technological features or technological affordances of social media platforms that can change the scope, the scale, and the precision of disinformation campaigns in our contemporary age. The first thing we can talk about is algorithms and the way that algorithms might prioritize certain kinds of information over others. They might amplify or prioritize sensation, rumor, fake news, these kinds of disinformation stories over things that are actually true. We always have the saying that, like sex sells and people like rumor. And so algorithms tend to feed off of what users like and share and engage with. And sometimes these things that we like to read and engage in on social media aren't necessarily good for democracy or for truth, but they do have a propensity to go viral. And so the algorithmic amplification of disinformation is kind of one of these new features. It's just so much more prevalent and present on our social media news feeds. Another thing that's really new about social media is that disinformation is networked. So, in the past, if we're thinking about traditional propaganda campaigns, they'd have to go through gatekeepers, such as, the media, the printing, people who had access to the printing press, governments. They'd have to go and create these leaflets, maybe fly them over a particular area or territory, and share them through this kind of top-down system. But now disinformation can be bottom up and networked, and people like you and I can actually participate in disinformation. We can be the ones who create it and share it over social media to friends and family, to our broader networks. And so that's another thing that's really new about disinformation in today's era. Of course, we've always been able to gossip and talk about rumor, but the scale at which these kinds of messaging can spread is so much more significant than in the past. A third thing that's really new and interesting about disinformation in the contemporary is that we can automate it. And by this, I mean we can create bots, sometimes known as political bots, that are pieces of code. They're designed to mimic human behavior. So they'll do things like, share, retweet certain pieces of content and act human, but they're not actually human. And so these bots can create momentum or virality around a particular person or a particular idea by following certain accounts or amplifying certain narratives at a scale to which no person could. And then the final point that I like to bring up that's new about disinformation in this social media contemporary era is that it's data driven. So going back to my example of, flying and dropping the leaflets down, we had no idea who picked up these leaflets, who read them, if those messages even resonated with the people who were seeing them. But on social media, we can measure all of this. We can measure people's time spent looking at a particular page. We can measure what they click, what they open, and we can create pictures of who people are as citizens and as voters, and then fine tune our messaging through various kind of testing strategies to see what resonates, what sticks, what gets people galvanized, what suppresses people and discourages them to vote, and use these digital technologies then to spread disinformation and shape elections.
So just continuing on that theme, Mark, of misinformation and disinformation, to what extent are these things internet governance problems?
Yeah, and like most interesting questions, the answer to that is, well, it depends. And the first thing it depends on is whether or not you understand internet governance in this sort of narrower sense that I started with, or the broader sense that I finished with in answer to your first question. If you understand internet governance narrowly, it's not actually clear that these are internet governance problems, because what kind of data transits over the network and whether or not it's true or false or interesting or uninteresting or any of those things is kind of irrelevant to how the internet technically operates. But the problem is these are certainly internet policy problems. And the thing that policymakers can do in response to a policy problem is require private sector actors of various kinds to take certain kinds of action. So we're starting to see governments, as a matter of internet policy, sort of take steps to effectively demand or require different sorts of private sector actors, whether they're social media platforms or whether they are internet operators, network operators that operate the underlying technical network, to take certain kinds of steps to deal with this sort of recognized policy problem that Samantha was talking about, of sort of digital misinformation. So then it becomes an internet governance problem, because that governance is sort of encumbered by this policy requirement to take or not take a certain kind of step, right? To block or not block certain kinds of speech, to allow or disallow certain kinds of people to create accounts, to allow or disallow bots or sort of these automated accounts. So all of these are ways in which the sort of narrow sense of internet governance can be affected by the broader sense of internet policy. And that's really, I think, the space we're in now, where we're trying to figure out in every different country around the world, right, what the sort of framework is, how we sort of want to handle these problems. The problem for platforms, and to a lesser extent for network operators, they operate in multiple jurisdictions. That means all of a sudden they have a very complex compliance problem where they need to operate their platform perhaps differently in Germany than in the United States, or differently in France than in South Korea. That creates all kinds of problems for a company that's trying to operate a business of this kind. It also creates problems for users, because if you're a resident in one country and do something that's legal under the policy framework in your own country, and then you travel on vacation or business to a country with a different legal framework, there is some possibility that you could be held civilly or even criminally liable for certain kinds of activity online. And that really points out the way in which this internet policy is decentralized radically, while internet governance is actually in some ways highly centralized, in the sense that the sort of technical standards and protocols are globally identical, or virtually globally identical. So we have this collision of this global system with this decentralized system of sovereign states that's creating really interesting problems, at the same time as we also have these technologies being used by various kinds of both public and private actors around the world to cause real harm. So there's a sort of interesting and difficult problem set here.
Really interesting. Samantha, I'm sure all of us, especially academics, people who comment on issues, take position on interpretation of research results, etc., have been faced with trolls, as we know, and people who say things publicly and you turn around and say, wow, can they say that? Can they actually do that? Who do I complain to? And then you run out of time to complain. But anyway, what are social media companies doing to combat this disinformation on their platforms? What about the movement of people platforms like Parler or Truth Social affect what can be done at, say, the company level?
Yeah, so really great question, especially when we're thinking about combating these kinds of problems. Mark highlighted how different kinds of private actors, maybe down the stack, might enforce different levers to control content, but platforms are kind of like the first line of defense, and some of the actors that have a lot of power in shaping what we see online, because they are the ones that control, for the most part, what happens on their specific platforms. Of course, there are companies that are more powerful than Facebook, and we have seen private actors take entire social media platforms down. For example, Parler, which is a popular kind of alt-right platform, was taken down by Apple's App Store and by Amazon, so people could no longer use these social media platforms. But this is kind of just to say that the governance area for controlling content is vast, and social media companies make up a big part of it. And they're taking a lot of steps to limit the amounts of harmful content and harmful accounts on their platform. But I think, again, as Mark highlighted, they're operating at such a scale that is global in nature with billions of people. And so the extent to which these kinds of steps are successful is very much up for debate. And also the extent to which these are the right solutions to the problem is very much up for debate. So I'll highlight a couple of different things that platforms have done over the past maybe 3-4 years to combat some of these challenges around mis and disinformation. The first thing that we've seen is they've hired a lot more content moderators, so human workers and staff to work in specific country contexts to review content and make those decisions as to whether or not it should stay up or come down. For a long time, there's been a lot of criticism on platform responses around content moderation. They don't necessarily provide good benefits to the people who do this work. There's a lot of trauma and things involved in this kind of work. If you're constantly looking at violative content, sensitive content, things that need to be taken off, that can take a toll on workers. They tend to be low paid, and not representative of the areas where they're moderating. So there's been a big push to try and hire more moderators to address some of these challenges. Another thing that we've seen social media platforms do in the recent years is introduce labeling policies. Here, if a story that has been fact-checked as false is shared on social media, platforms will apply information labels to that content to link to maybe a place where people can find information about COVID-19 or find information about elections that are happening in their country. Different kind of labels will actually say this article is disputed and link to fact-checked resources. Sometimes these labels get applied to different kinds of harmful content. If someone's doing a stunt on TikTok, it will get a safety label to not try this at home. So these are different kinds of interventions that platforms have introduced to content that people can see. We've also seen them make algorithmic changes and update their algorithms to try to demote certain kinds of content that might be considered harmful. Some of this has had a positive effect, I'd say, and some of it has had a negative effect. For example, Facebook updated its algorithm, I think in 2018, to prioritize what they call meaningful interactions. And these would be things that they considered meaningful interactions people may be commenting on posts that friends and family shared, exchanging private messages over the kinds of content, using different kinds of indicators of people having one-on-one conversations with one another to say this is high quality content, this is good content. But we know from a lot of research that people tend to type when they're angry and when they're experiencing extreme emotion. So this can be happy things, and this is why we see cat memes and videos and cute animals going viral on the internet, because when people experience a very positive emotion, they want to share it or comment. But it's also true, and more true, for negative emotions, things that make us afraid, things that make us angry, things that make us resentful. And so this algorithmic update tended to prioritize things that got people typing and things that made people angry. And we actually saw more disinformation and more anger and outrage on social media as a result of this tweak. And this was something that was covered in the Facebook papers. And then finally, we can think of platform interventions kind of, not within the platform themselves, but outside the platform. We've seen companies make a lot of investments into media literacy, into programming for schools to help students learn better digital literacy schools. Here, my comment is that I think digital literacy is something that's lifelong and something that we need to make investments in at all ages. But these are just kind of to give you a taste of what social media platforms are doing. There's a bunch of different interventions at different kinds of levels and in different kinds of ways that platforms have been trying to address these issues around mis and disinformation.
Fascinating. Thank you. Mark, we've heard a lot of news about Elon Musk and Twitter and his apparent plan to take Twitter private. How will this plan affect global efforts to combat mis and disinformation?
Well, just a couple of things on what Samantha was talking about a moment ago first, because I think it sort of transitions nicely here. The thing that we have to remember when we talk about, well, what are platforms doing, is that actually the platforms have to some extent adverse interests to the public here. And they have adverse interests to the public in the sense that what keeps us occupied and engaged and on their platform is good business for them. It may be very unhealthy for us as individuals and unhealthy for society as a whole, but it's good business for them. So that sort of brings me to Elon Musk, because his political views are murky and difficult to categorize, but he certainly has social ties to and sort of experience with people on the alt-right in the United States. And there are some concerns that one of his purposes in buying Twitter is effectively to let Donald Trump or people like him back on the platform. He would clearly have the ability to do that if it's a private company with very little oversight. So what that does is really make this piece of what we've been calling the digital public sphere very dependent on Elon Musk's sole decision making. I think in general, it's bad policy for something so publicly important globally to be dependent on any single person. I think it was problematic already when Twitter was a publicly traded company based in the United States. I think it's even more so now with this looming transition, because it puts us all basically beholden to this one person. And I think that's a really bad sort of position to find ourselves in. To the extent that I actually think the entire sort of language around what we call the digital public sphere is actually misleading. I don't think we have a public sphere here in any important sense, because it's not public, right? We use it like a public sphere, but if you actually look at the governance of it, it's almost entirely privatized in the hands of very wealthy shareholders and private owners from a very small group of countries, largely the United States right now. But I think in general, that creates really important problems. So for example, I know the Canadian Parliament has been trying to get Mark Zuckerberg to testify. They have been utterly unsuccessful in compelling him to do so. By the way, so has the British Parliament. Britain is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. It is one of the 5 sort of recognized nuclear weapons states on the planet, and yet it can't successfully compel the CEO of a social media company to testify before its democratic parliament when that company exercises really important sort of effects on democracy in Britain. That's a really problematic state of affairs. And I think it's something that, is difficult for countries like Canada and Britain. It's even more difficult for countries that are lower income and that don't have the sort of international sort of social capital that advanced industrial democracies have. And so I think this really I think it's enormously problematic. I think it's even if he has good intentions, and even if there are some positive developments, I don't think it's a positive step for the world that Twitter is a private company, period, let alone one owned by someone as complicated as Elon Musk.
Thanks, Mark. Samantha, just along the point that Mark raised about the digital public sphere, or question mark, you mentioned schools and other kinds of intervention. What can citizens do to strengthen the digital public sphere?
Yeah, so, I think citizens are a big part of the solution to a lot of the challenges around mis and disinformation. We can't just rely on governments to regulate. We can't rely on platforms to moderate. Citizens also have to take meaningful actions to promote democracy. Democracy is hard work, right? We have to negotiate consensus with people who we might not necessarily agree with. I think one of the challenges is that social media has made it a very hard environment to have a lot of these political conversations and debates because of the way that it tends to amplify anger and outrage and polarize us kind of along, partisan, racial lines. So citizens need to put in some of the work here too. This doesn't just mean like Google fact checking things for yourself. We actually, some of the research is showing that if you tell someone to Google the facts, that they will actually find the facts that support their view and become further entrenched in their beliefs, whether they're true or not. So, encouraging, and I think working on digital literacy, scientific literacy, across all ages is really, really important here. Not just teaching people to find the facts, but really how to evaluate factual information and scientific claims, and giving them the tools to critically look at information and content and news and journalistic findings in a way that will actually be meaningful and support them in that way. And as much as citizens do play a role, though, I don't want to overemphasize the role of citizens in this problem, because I think it's really important to remember that social media platforms have created this environment that really makes disinformation like a very systemic problem, and the way in which it again polarizes us. It can decrease our trust in media and other kinds of institutions. A lot of these negative outcomes, it's very systemic to the way that the platform is designed, which is built on this business model of surveillance capitalism, where our data is used to target us with ads and other kinds of information that will keep us on the platform longer. And as I was saying before, this kind of content, it might not necessarily be good for democracy. And so while citizens play some role in this, I think we really need to look to the platforms for better solutions to the problem of disinformation, and solutions that get at this systemic problem of their business models, of surveillance capitalism, of attention economics, the things that keep us addicted to scrolling, right? These are the real issues here. Disinformation is very much a surface level issue. It's the thing that we can easily see and point to, but constantly trying to take down content through moderators or through automated systems isn't going to work in the long term. That's just going to be a constant game of whack-a-mole. Instead, we need to think about some of the underlying causes of why this content goes viral in the first place, and focus our strategies there and our responses there.
Great. Well, let me pick up on one thing you said and one thing Mark said earlier on. So the issue of surveillance, and Mark talked about this disjointedness between a global approach and global policy, and then the policies and the capacity to enforce those policies of individual nations. So Mark, since 2016, the working understanding of has been that authoritarian regimes have crucial advantages compared to democracies in shaping the global information ecosystem. And yet Ukraine has substantially outperformed Russia in shaping narratives, you could argue, about the current phase of Russia's war against Ukraine, at least in Western countries. So to what extent are there lessons to be learned for other democracies from experiences like these?
Yeah, it's, it's a tough question, right? Because I think the key phrase is, at least in Western democracies, and what I think we observe is the best available public polling of opinion in Russia says that somewhere north of 80% of Russians are broadly supportive of the war. That's a problem, right? We haven't been able to break through in Russia, despite the fact that Ukraine has done a lot of really interesting things to try and do that, right? Having captive Russian soldiers phone their relatives in Russia, those kinds of efforts, and then doing media around those, the really interesting videos about their use of drone technology, including with a very catchy song about the drone. So a lot of interesting efforts. They've been broadly successful at keeping Western countries, and Western countries have had other assets here that have played a role in sort of keeping them unified here. But we haven't broken through on the other side yet. And China and India, the governments there have refused to condemn, and in some ways are continuing to support the Russian government despite its actions in Ukraine. So I think, for me, the big lesson is what we might be seeing here is evidence of sort of a decoupling, of sort of a pulling apart of a sort of notion of a global internet or global information ecosystem, to the extent that we ever really had one. I think that this sort of event is sort of pushing it along a trajectory toward sort of different kinds of spaces. To some extent, I don't think that's an entirely bad thing, but I'm also sort of not very optimistic that this will sort of, for example, stop actors on the political right in the United States or in Canada or elsewhere from trying to do some of the same things that Russia had been doing to destabilize elections. I also don't think Russia is going to stop trying to do those things. So I don't know that there's a general lesson. At least on this issue, it looks like there's enough social cohesion around the idea that Russia is an opponent. And I think that's actually doing a lot of the work. So that old Cold War legacy, especially among older populations, I would suspect is probably doing a lot of the work of generating unity in Western countries about this issue. And it looks like so far disinformation efforts from Russia and from actors aligned with it haven't broken through that. Hopefully that will continue. Sort of not to put cards on the table, but in this case, I don't think that's a particularly hard call. But I'm not sure there are general lessons. I think it's interesting. And I think, the question you ask points to, well, why have we been able to maintain social cohesion within Western democracies more on this issue than we did on our own elections? That surprises me. But maybe it shouldn't, because elections are inherently partisan, right? We're inherently sort of used to being divided about elections, where we're not used to being divided about, for example, a geopolitical threat from Russia. So it might be that sort of reservoir of collective memory that's doing a lot of the work in this particular case. So at least that's good that we don't sort of destabilize on basic security issues. But if it doesn't save our democracy, kind of what's the point? So I think there's still a really big problem here. I don't entirely know that I have the answer to the question, but I think it is a question that we certainly need to be asking and thinking about. Why have we seen more social cohesion about this war than we have about our own elections? That's a really important question.
So I want to follow up on the issue of democracy. Samantha, you said democracy is hard work, and I would agree with that. Rights are privileges, often not to be abused. So what are the consequences of disinformation for civic life, things like political speech, political participation, so democracy writ large?
Yeah, so, I think there's a couple of implications for and effects that disinformation can have on democracies writ large. A lot of the research on kind of the effects and the impacts of these technologies and disinformation on things like polarization or decreasing trust, things that I'll go into more detail in a minute. I just want to emphasize that a lot of this research is still kind of in the works. We don't necessarily have a full picture of, how social media influences polarization or affects people's political speech and so on, because again, and so much of the data that we could use to evaluate and measure these kinds of outcomes is held by the companies, and access for researchers is very, very difficult. And there's also the other side of it where people don't just only get their news and information from social media. We still get information from TV, Fox News, and a lot of these kinds of right-leaning media play a big role in shaping people's political opinions and attitudes, and fomenting polarization and things like that too. So it's hard to only focus on social media's effect. We need to think about this problem within a broader kind of context too. So with that said, I think there are three sort of areas where people are thinking about the consequences of this for democracy. The first, and I've mentioned it a bunch of times, has to do with polarization. Polarization has been increasing since before the internet and before social media. Before we've had mobile phones and before we've had computers, the trends for polarization have been widening. But social media, and there's a lot of research that shows that social media might have amplified or encouraged the speed at which this widening has been happening between two different kinds of, between party lines, across party lines. In particular, it has more to do with affective polarization, which is the idea that I don't like the person who might be on the other side of the political line, and I have strong feelings of animosity or resentment towards the people. So it's not necessarily a disagreement on the issues, but it's much more about how I feel about people who don't share the same political values as me. And so this can be really troubling for other kinds of implications. The second one that I wanted to highlight is political violence, where, with January 6th in the US, there are increasing examples of the ways in which disinformation on social media can fuel violence and real world violence. Not just harassment and trolling online, but actually getting people to go out and riot on the streets, or to injure and even kill people involved in the political system. January 6th in the US is one example, but we've seen other disinformation campaigns have effects, in Myanmar, where there's been a whole genocide of people. In Mexico, during a gubernatorial race, bots made premature claims to victory, and there was a bunch of people who were murdered and killed in that state because of this disinformation campaign. So political violence is another kind of implication of disinformation on social media. Polarization, and then finally, the last one that I wanted to highlight was decreasing levels of trust in the media and public institutions. And, I think this is particularly relevant when we're thinking about the COVID-19 pandemic, and people's ability to trust science and to trust in vaccines and to trust government mandates, so that we can, create a safe environment for everybody, right? There's been huge levels of skepticism, and a lot of movements have emerged on social media against government mandates, against vaccine mandates, against masking mandates. And all of this kind of stems from growing distrust in these institutions and organizations that are designed to help our democracies and help our societies. So these, I think, are some of the three of the biggest kind of implications we think about when we're thinking about how disinformation affects democracy.
Great. As somebody's just asked, can you quickly respond to elaborate very quickly on the Mexican case?
Yeah, so I can link a DFR Lab article to chat at some point after this, but there was a bot network that was found to be operating in one of the gubernatorial races in Mexico. I think it was the Puebla province, but don't quote me on that. I need to relook at the article. And it was making premature claims to victory. It was saying, I think that the oppositional candidate had won before the ballots and everything had been counted. And so people went to the streets, they were burning ballots that still hadn't been counted. And then there was a lot of people who were injured or even killed in kind of that riot as a result of these bots and these accounts on social media making that those premature claims to victory.
Great, thanks so much. Mark, over to you on the misinformation, disinformation. Is it likely to sort of nudge the world along a trajectory of technological decoupling in ways similar to concerns about networking hardware, cybersecurity, and other cyber policy challenges? So in essence, how would such a world differ from the one that we inhabit now?
Yeah, I think, it's certainly likely to create more public demand for a bit more separation, right? And a bit more sort of caution when it comes to sort of thinking about a globally integrated information environment. And frankly, and this is a personal view, I think that it probably should generate some caution about that. And maybe that's a provocation that folks in the audience will want to talk about. I think we might be seeing that, maybe the technology's gotten a little bit far ahead here, and maybe a little bit slower and more deliberate pace of sort of developing these technologies, especially given their potential to create social harm, might be a good thing. Now, how we get that, I don't know, because slowing down the sort of creativity of humans is proven to be a very difficult thing to do. So maybe that's not possible. If it's not possible, I'm not really sure how this plays out. And, the question of how it happens and how this world would differ, I think maybe in the interest of time, I want to be a little bit hazy about, simply because I want to make sure we get to some audience questions. But I think it would depend a lot on how it happened, right? The sort of precise chain of events that would lead to, for example, a major country deciding to sort of limit its connectivity to the global internet. Right. Some countries already do that. China already does it. So that's one model of how this might play out and happen. I think that's a very extreme model, and it's certainly not one I would sort of recommend or advocate. But, there is an interesting effort that's being sort of promoted by a group of network operators and people involved in the internet technical community to create what they call multi-stakeholder internet sanctions against the Russian government. And what they mean is to encourage and publicize an effort to get network operators not to exchange internet traffic with web domains and IP addresses linked to the Russian government. This is, to my knowledge, the first use of the term multi-stakeholder sanctions in history. Sanctions are often unilateral by governments. They're sometimes multilateral through the United Nations or through NATO or through other international organizations. But this is the sort of first time sort of civil society group has stood out there and said, yeah, we're trying to impose sanctions. We usually would have called this a boycott. Whether or not that's meaningfully different, whether or not it's politically provocative to do, I think is a really interesting question. There's not sort of one way this can happen, and I think there are a lot of ways it can happen badly. But I think more broadly, for policymakers, having some degree of caution or skepticism about greater connectivity, particularly for social media, at least in the short to medium term, in my view, seems warranted. The problem is doing that within a democracy that has robust protections for freedom of speech. And it's a really difficult policy problem that I don't have a full solution to.
So Sam, let's put the last question to you then. What threats are on the horizon? Let's look back 5 years to see where we've come. Let's look ahead by 5 years to see what's in store for us. Please comment on these issues.
Yeah, definitely. So if we're thinking ahead to kind of the threats on the horizon and what a lot of people are worried about, so the first issue that I can bring up is the question of deep fakes. And this is often talked about in conversations about misinformation and disinformation. And deep fakes are essentially AI networks that create images of people that can move and sound and look exactly like a person, but it's not actually real. And so you can create these fake videos of people saying and doing things that they never actually said and did. It's really popular in like the pornography industry, where a lot of women are used in these deep fake videos to create pornographic films. But there's this fear that this kind of technology could be leveraged for politics. Maybe, at the 11th hour of an election, this video drops and might influence a bunch of people to vote a certain kind of way, or to stay at home and not vote because of something that happened in this deepfake video. I think there's a lot of skepticism around this technology and whether or not it will actually have an effect on democracy or fool or influence people, especially if what we call cheap fakes, or just like slightly edited videos or manipulated content, can have some kind of damaging effect on a person's legitimacy, or the legitimacy of an election writ large. But I still think it's important to keep these technologies and notions in mind when we're thinking about threats down the line, especially as this kind of imaging gets so much more sophisticated. We already know that the technology that uses deepfakes is often used to create fake profile pictures and to generate fake people and fake accounts online to varying degrees of success. So we're already seeing this technology today, and I do think it will continue to improve, and we'll find ways to avoid detection and things like that down the line if we don't continue to pay attention to it. Another really interesting kind of threat vector that I'd like to bring up is the Internet of Things and disinformation. So I think this can be brought up in two kinds of ways. The first has to do with the ways that the Internet of Things collects more and more data about us as people. So being able to measure somebody's heart rate when they are watching some kind of propaganda video or disinformation video, to not only measure how long they're staying and viewing a page, but that actual physiological reaction people have to certain kinds of messaging could empower and change the precision of disinformation in new and horrendous ways to an extent. But we can also think about disinformation in the technology. And so it's not just about disinformation trying to change people's minds, but disinformation trying to affect computers and sensors. And here comes my dog. I was joking with the panel, with everyone earlier, saying she's going to come barging in here after her walk. But yeah, thinking about, it's not just about the way that disinformation affects people and tries to influence and manipulate people, but it can influence and manipulate sensors and things that are increasingly part of our world because of the Internet of Things. Maybe instead of, sending somebody a disinformation message about an election, we could just create a cyber attack that sets off their home security alarm, and they'd have to go home instead of going out to vote, or creates a traffic jam, which might discourage people from going out and voting at an election. A traffic jam that's not actually there. So thinking about disinformation, not just at the human level, but within the technology and in these kind of new threat vectors, I think is a really interesting and unique way of thinking about these problems down the line.
Thanks so much. For both of you, there's a question on algorithmic patterns and how information that's shaped by algorithmic patterns that are meant to disrupt democracies, increase social attention, encourage both racism and misogyny, may, in terms of their content, be in violation of various laws and international agreements between free societies and countries. Why has the legitimate and accountable regulatory framework failed to act with both precision and prosecutorial ambition to enforce the laws and protect the freedom of expression by combating this subversion? So weakness in defense of the orderly protection of freedoms is no virtue. Strength in avoiding regulatory responsibility is absolutely a public policy vice. So could both of you comment on that? Mark, quickly to you.
Yeah, so I think this is a fascinating question, especially in light of the author of the question, which I won't say publicly. But so this is a really interesting demand because the political right, largely in the United States and Britain, to a lesser extent in Canada, has been waging about a 40-year sort of project of dismantling the regulatory state, starving regulatory agencies of the capacity that they need to investigate and enforce various kinds of regulations. The question, therefore, sort of has a sense of wanting to have one's cake and eat it too, which I think is really interesting, because if you wanted to do what the questioner asks, you would effectively need to hire a whole bunch of people. You would need to vastly expand the regulatory state, which is something that people on the political right are usually, for various reasons, some of them quite good, very skeptical of. And yet here we see this demand. So that's a really interesting sort of thing. It's also not clear to me that this is really entirely the approach to the right, the problem here, right? So certain kinds of speech are certainly clearly criminal in various kinds of political contexts, but in many countries around the world, it's political dissent that is itself criminalized. And so I think the idea of sort of heading headlong down this path is a really dangerous one in most countries in the world. Even in established democracies, it's not really entirely clear that we want the government evaluating the truth content of political speech, right? The United States very recently had a bit of a kerfuffle about this because the administration announced the creation of what they're calling the Disinformation Governance Board. That came under harsh criticism from the political right on the basis that this was sort of government sort of putting its thumb on the scale in the marketplace of ideas, which again is something that on the political right is very unpopular. Against this, we have to recognize the nature of law enforcement has fundamentally changed. A few years ago already, a colleague of mine heard from someone in the United Kingdom in their policing services that 90% plus of the investigations that the British police run, police in Britain writ large, require data that's held by American companies. The main mechanism for international law enforcement cooperation is this web of outdated bilateral treaties that are called mutual legal assistance treaties, or MLATs. They were built for a pre-digital age in which there were occasional requests to, for example, serve a warrant to search a physical premises. Utterly different than what we're seeing right now. This system doesn't scale. So it's totally broken by the nature of the internet, which exposes much more of our private speech to the potential eye of law enforcement, often through the private sector. So that's a really different environment. And it's not clear that we should really want to expand the scope of policing that fully if so much of our speech is going to be digitally intermediated. So I think there are really complex questions embedded in this question. I don't think it has an easy answer. And I think it's particularly fascinating the way that interacts and intersects with partisan politics in North America, especially right now.
Thanks, Mark. How about you, Samantha, on this question?
Yeah, I think I agree a lot with what Mark has raised. And again, I think a lot of it comes down to the fact that regulating speech and trying to take down every piece of violative content isn't going to work in the long run because of the way that algorithms prioritize and work in black boxes, right? Like these deeper questions around the business models and the incentives of them to amplify certain kinds of stories that keep us on the platform longer is the real question here and the real challenge, and where I think regulators should be focusing their attention when we're thinking about policy solutions to these problems, rather than creating regulatory frameworks around the criminalization of certain kinds of content. We've already seen, for example, like Russia take NetDG and put it into their own legal system as a way to crack down on their own political dissidents by saying this kind of content is against the law, and so now we can prosecute you. Germany does it, so we can do it too, right? These kinds of laws might serve as a way to legitimize further censorship and control in authoritarian regimes when we focus on the content. Rather, I think there are other solutions that focus on the business models that, give researchers more access to data so that we can can really fundamentally understand the problem, because, you know, to take this a step back, we don't really have good insight into what the scale of the problem is. We've had like some tidbits. There have been some leaks from Facebook's and other social media companies' own internal research. There have been some studies, but there are significant limitations to the kind of research that academics and that civil society can do. And so getting and working with regulators to create access to data for scientific inquiry, I think, is, you know, one of the big areas where we can actually see something kind of meaningful come out, so that, you know, research can actually inform policy rather than like hoping it informs policy, and that, you know, our results are conclusive enough to make good suggestions to fix these problems. So, you know, I think we need to look in these kinds of areas. We need to look at the business models and the incentive structures and other kinds of issues around the content rather than the content itself.
Just related to that, the second question is, machine learning social media algorithms like TikTok become more prevalent, and the resulting algorithmic black box supersedes user content flags like hashtags. Do you believe regulators can still effectively target disinformation and other online harms? Mark, what do you have to say on that quickly, please?
Yeah, so really quickly, the thing I would point out is, yes, absolutely. There is no reason legally that governments can't make changes allowing them to compel platforms of various kinds to turn over their algorithms, at least for very limited tailored purposes. These companies typically hide behind notions in law of trade secrets. Well, those could be scoped appropriately so that they don't preclude government having the ability to provide at least some oversight of how that algorithm is operating. And I think that is really one of the largest changes that could be made, that could be really powerful. I think it would be highly useful for small countries like Canada to sort of band together with other countries around the world to create a global framework, or at least a sort of multilateral framework for the sort of proper handling of those kinds of oversight of private algorithms. That seems to me like low-hanging fruit to get started on. I hope that the government of Canada or other governments around the world might take that up.
Great, thanks. Samantha, you can comment on that too if you have something to say, but there's another question in the chat saying, I'm wondering how data analytics companies such as Palantir, data brokerages such as Axiom would change the nature of surveillance and government corporate relations in the next 30 years. Do you see a boom in the privatization of state surveillance?
Yeah, definitely. And Mark, if you have comments on this question too, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. You know, I think certainly, like, you know, there's all those sayings that like data is like the new oil, it's the new resource. I agree with them to an extent, because I think data can say a lot about people and a lot about citizens, and we're increasingly creating more and more points of surveillance for people. And this industry with the Palantirs and the Axioms of the world is immense in terms of the data brokers and the people who are trying to collect data about us and build up these profiles about us. You know, Cambridge Analytica in the context of elections is, you know, one of these companies where we can see the use of this kind of data for ill and for harm, where detailed profiles about people as voters are then used to target them with voter suppression messages. And so I certainly think that there's going to we're going to continue to see this industry increase again, especially as we develop new technologies with new kinds of sensors, like the Internet of Things. It's not, you know, only our internet and mobile devices that are tracking us. It's our Fitbits, our health monitors, our home security systems, our baby monitors. All the sensors on the roads for smart cars and environmental sensors. There's so much that is out there tracking and collecting information about us as people moving through the world. And so I certainly think that this industry will continue to grow, especially without kind of regulation that's going to be able to address some of the harms or place limits on this kind of data restriction in new technologies going forward.
Thanks, Samantha. Mark, 30 seconds on the issue of state surveillance, and then we'll wrap.
Yeah, so there's certainly a lot more of it. In Western countries, it's a really complex interaction between private firms and government agencies. Some of those private firms devoted to working with governments, in some cases government security agencies trying to penetrate their own private firms and firms in other countries. The last point I would make is that this is a really different landscape than we see, for example, in China and other highly authoritarian states, where that data collection is not being privatized, but rather is still being held in a central sort of public way and is really an effort or venture of the state, often in cooperation with and collaboration with firms from other authoritarian countries and even governments from other authoritarian countries like China.
Thank you so much. And thank you to both of you. You have just been amazing. Like, I learned so much, the audience has learned so much. I'm getting all sorts of comments by email, etc. You're very, very bright people. Keep up the fantastic work. Thank you to the audience for joining us, and please join us for our next critical conversation, as it will be advertised on our Twitter handle and our other social media platforms. Thank you once again to the panelists, and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.